These battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak with their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. With me tonight is my guest, who is Alex Lawson. How you doing, Alex?
Great. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about what happened to the Postal Service in a historical context. And without getting into too much detail, let's start from the beginning, because a lot of people don't know that in the beginning, the Postal Service was a way for us to have free speech, because that's how pamphlets used to get disseminated. And I learned that from reading a book by Robert McChesney and John McNichols. So why don't you tell us a brief history of the Postal Service and go to the point of when it became something that had to pay for itself.
You're absolutely right. When the Postal Service was founded, I think people don't fully understand how revolutionary the idea of everybody in the country being able to send mail and communicate with each other was. At the time, that was not how it was done around the world. The ability to communicate gives people the ability to organize. The ability to communicate gives people the ability to write their politicians for a redress of grievances. It is a massively powerful shift to say that people's voices matter. And that's what the Postal Service means. That's what it was created. That's why it's not just like a little additional thing that our country created, or some agency or bureau or something like that. It's in the founding documents, not as an afterthought, but as a central part of the creation of this country. And it truly was revolutionary. I say that over and over again so people get it. The ability for a person, no matter where they were, to write to Washington, D.C. and say, listen up, member of Congress, senator, or the president, something's going on that's wrong. The Teapot Dome scandal. Now I'm zooming through history a few hundred years, but like through the different progressive eras, like 1830s and things like that, they expanded it, what the Postal Service meant, but it always did have this deeply American thing that the post office in a town was a sort of centering agency. The town was built around it. So you could be out in the West and there wasn't much there except for a post office. But that was enough to build this country. And that's how important it is. And it basically stayed that way, plus or minus some, up until the 70s. And the 70s is really where, you start seeing what leads to the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal reactionary tumult around the world. And at that point, they shifted it from a service, from something that is ours by right, to something that needs to be a business and therefore has to be profitable. It has to pay its own way. It's no longer about a citizen or a resident's ability to write their government for a redress of grievances. It's much more about the government trying to extract some money out of the people, because it has this whole neoliberal idea, right? That the public goods are not efficient. The private sector can do it better. And we all know that's garbage. We all know that what that really means is that the private sector they're gonna pick and choose some powerful billionaires. They're gonna carve up the public goods, and then they're gonna take them for private gain, make billions of dollars, and throw a little bit of that back to the politicians to keep the gravy train going. I usually sum it up, and I use this example for the tactic across the government, but what they do is they kneecap the mailman, then they complain that the mail is late, and they just so happen to have a cousin who's in the private mail delivery service.
Yeah. But now, was there some law around that time, Reagan, Thatcher, that required that the post office pay for itself? That's the part I'm missing.
Yes, in the 1970s, there's a law passed that actually shifts the burden of the post office, being an agency from just the general fund is paying for this because it's a service, to the postal service now has to actually pay for itself. And it's a sort of public private venture. That's where you're getting into. That's what I mean by that. Like, it's the runway to the full Reagan Thatcher. You started seeing hints of it earlier under Jimmy Carter and even earlier, but that's what it is. It's the idea of creating these public-private ventures where the public holds the risk and the private gets the gains.
Right. And for people that haven't followed me before, my whole thrust as an activist, organizer, and an independent journalist is to fight neoliberalism, which is just that, where they try to make us believe that the private industry can provide public goods and services cheaper, better, and faster than the government. And that's absolutely a fallacy, because in order to do it, and we'll be getting to healthcare later, in order to be profitable, they actually have to cut the very service they're providing. In healthcare, when they pay out a medical claim on their balance sheet, they call it a medical loss. And how obscene is that, when that's the whole business model, is to not provide the service that they're supposed to be doing. So now let's go up to 2006, which is PAEA, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. And this was passed as a voice vote. My own liberal congressman back when I lived in Los Angeles, Henry Waxman, was one of the co-sponsors of it. Bernie Sanders actually voted for this, even though Bernie Sanders has been one of our biggest champions in trying to save the Postal Service. That act basically said that the Postal Service had to pre-fund healthcare benefits for employees 75 years into the future. So essentially for workers who hadn't even been born yet. And no other government agency, no other corporation for that matter, has that kind of requirement. And in my opinion, now this is what I want to ask you about, because the Washington Post seems to call that a myth. I think that was done to privatize the Postal Service, because they had been in the black. And then all of a sudden, when this responsibility came, this pre-funding mandate, then they went into the red. And they had to start selling off postal services, shortening hours. They were even talking about getting rid of Saturday services, cutting rural post offices. And one thing that I found out was that Richard Bloom, who is the husband of Dianne Feinstein, my old senator from California, his company was CBRE, a real estate firm. They had the exclusive no bid contract to sell or lease those postal services. And so when I ran into her in a protest that I was doing as part of an organization I started called Retire Feinstein, when I ran into her at a fundraiser and she came and spoke to us, I actually asked her about that. And I said, did you vote for that bill because your husband was profiting from it? She goes, what, my husband isn't profiting from it. I'll have to look into that, Anyway, it was really funny because I got actually interrupted by somebody from Indivisible who was, they were co-hosting this protest with us. And she says, we don't want to talk about something from 10 years old. We want to talk about Russia. And I look at her and I go, that's fake news. And then, so Dianne Feinstein says, we will talk about Russia, but first let me answer that question. And I remember thinking, oh my God, here I have her in my crosshairs, and this, this liberal interrupts me. But anyway, so the Washington Post essentially said that was a myth, that it was really that pre-funding mandate was just designed to, they had a lot of extra money because they were so profitable, and they didn't think it would be any kind of a burden on them, and it was just an accounting deal. But I found that other proof was that they refused to let the post office provide any other additional services, some of which we're going to talk about, like postal banks, internet cafes, things of that nature. So what is your opinion? Do you feel that act was designed to privatize the Postal Service?
Yeah, there's no question about it. The only like sort of thing that you need to do on that is zoom into that moment in 2006 and what was going on then that would lead to a voice vote or a unanimous vote on something. And there's a lot of wheeling and dealing that happens in DC, and there's an enormous amount of provisions that are thrown into bills. Everyone knows that George W. Bush was trying to privatize everything that he could as fast as possible. And again, for the symmetry's sake, just so people understand, it's not rocket science. It's always the same thing. They only got one play. George W. Bush is also the guy who tried to privatize Social Security, right? And that led directly to his downfall because Social Security, like the post office, are massively popular. Also, it is very true that sometimes you're fighting on one policy, one thing. And I was not involved in that fight in 2006, so I can't say specifically there, but I've seen this time and again in DC that you're fighting for one specific object and you're so focused on it that you don't notice a backdoor attack, and it's a flanking maneuver. And, especially because they've got these entire industries set up that is just in DC. It's just armies of lawyers just putting provisions in. And so like pre-funding the pension, I could even see somebody being like, oh, that doesn't sound that bad. But anyone from the pension world who would look at it and be like, this is garbage. This doesn't exist. This isn't a real thing, right? Like Social Security is like the public pension. Nancy Altman, the president of Social Security Works, is a private pension expert as well. We fight on private pensions a lot. We just had a huge victory in the American Rescue Plan on that. A full bailout of multi-employer pension plans, $86 billion. It's like a massive 1 million workers who don't have Wall Street picking their pockets. But anyone who knows about pensions, they're basically what it is there's green, yellow, and red. That's how basic it is. And you project out a number of years. And if your projection comes too close to today, then it's getting worse, right? So like 35 years out is 35 years out. That's pretty good. And as long as it stays out there, you're definitely in the green. No one projects out for 75 years. Where they got it from is Social Security, and it's the exact same thing. In Social Security, the 75-year horizon is used as a dagger aimed at the heart of Social Security, instead of saying Social Security is this massive program that is funded by the people. It doesn't contribute to the deficit. They're looking into 2095 and they're saying, oh, there could be a problem out there in 2095. And I'm like, the Pentagon's getting $700 billion, $800 billion a year. Social Security is a self-funded program. So the post office is the same thing. And just, again, for symmetry's sake, you want to know what they did when they couldn't use the 75-year horizon against Social Security because it's so conservatively, small c conservatively managed. It's so amazing. They actually switched it. This was George W. Bush era as well. So these attacks are the same. They switched it to an infinite time horizon. And they said it with a straight face. They still bring it up to me. They're like, yeah, but what about on the infinite time horizon? I'm like, well, on the infinite time horizon, the heat death of the universe is going to get to us before Social Security insolvency. I'm not that worried about it then. If you have to go to the year infinity, but it's because they're not actually looking at this to help, right? Like they're not actually worried about workers' health and pension benefits. They are using it as a weapon to destroy the Postal Service.
Right. Okay, so now let's get up to DeJoy, because the Postal Service, up until DeJoy, with all of its financial problems, still managed to deliver the mail on time. And all of a sudden, they bring this guy in. This guy's a logistics expert, and Trump brings him in, or I should say, the Board of Governors. Let's talk about that Board of Governors thing, so people can understand what we're asking. We want Biden to get rid of DeJoy, but he can't really do it because the Board of Governors is the one that hires and fires. But he's left the Board of Governors completely, there's nobody in there. Before we talk about that, let's talk about what was it that DeJoy did.
Actually, it's pretty unclear exactly how DeJoy accomplished everything he accomplished so quickly. We know he went in and did a lot of things. He got rid of these sorting machines, and he says, "Oh, these are superfluous," and he got rid of the blue boxes, and he's like, "Oh, these are superfluous." It all looks like classic slash and burn management style from like the 1980s.
But one thing about that, the Washington Post article did say, and I read that previously, that was planned prior to DeJoy, the sorting things and the mailboxes, because people just aren't sending letters anymore.
That's true. This is again, it's like reading tea leaves. And I want to say, I don't think anyone knows exactly how he broke it as fast as he did. But what we do know is that he did, because we look at the 90% rating that was just consistent throughout all these attacks. And then DeJoy takes over and it plummets, right? And the IG says, like, look, this happened, right? So DeJoy takes over, boom, this happens. He did these things. He got rid of the sorting machines. And then people are like, oh, well, that was long in the works. But in Washington, D.C., there are some things that are long in the works. They're 30 years in the works, but they don't happen because everyone knows if they do happen, it's a really bad idea. And so it's just more like an eternal struggle. And so someone coming in and just implementing all of the worst ideas from previous administrations can have an incredibly damaging effect. And what we know is that happened. People, seniors at Social Security Works, we advocate for seniors, people with disabilities primarily. And seniors weren't getting their medicines. Farmers in rural America rely on the Postal Service for 2-day delivery of chicks, for chickens. The whole business model is based on that. It's 2 days, live chicks are delivered to where they're needed. The chicks were turning up dead because the whole system was just screwed up. And DeJoy accomplished that. And that's why DeJoy was put in there, to accomplish it. So if you'll allow me, I'll go to the Board of Governors because it's like kind of confusing, but not that confusing. Obama tried to appoint many members of the Board and of Governors who are needed. He also did not do everything that he could to get these appointments through. And that's actually across many aspects of the government. But at the same time, you had Mitch McConnell and the Republicans doing everything they could to block anybody getting on the board. And this is like stealing the Supreme Court seat. When Donald Trump took over, Mitch McConnell had been so successful at his efforts that there was literally no one on the Board of Governors. So everyone on the Board of Governors was a Trump appointee, including the so-called Democrats. So there's Democrats on the board, but they got put in place by Donald Trump. And then you have this really weird thing that happens, which is basically Mnuchin comes in, like the comic book of Bond villain, that DeJoy and Mnuchin are the twin horsemen of the private equity apocalypse, right? If you ever see them coming for you, DeJoy's going to destroy your business and Mnuchin's going to profit off the destruction. Mnuchin actually creates, and it's very improper, and everyone has said it's improper. It's, like DC is like, oh, this is very bad. You should never do this. But they did it, and they got DeJoy in. And that's something that I want to return to, because you know what Trump and the Republicans do when there's all sorts of like blocks and procedural hurdles to accomplishing their ends? They ignore them. They bulldoze through them. They use power to accomplish their aims. That's what they do. And then when the Democrats get power, they start being like norms and procedure, norms and procedure. And the problem is the Democrats are like, oh, norms and procedure. That's right. We're the norms and procedure guys. But that means that you're not playing the same game, right? It means that Donald Trump gets to destroy the Postal Service, but your hands are tied when it comes to, getting a new postmaster general in there. And I call BS on that, right? There's a million things that the president of the United States can do. You can appoint a postal czar, just create an executive position that sits next to DeJoy and just drives him out, right? And just implements the Biden vision. there's a million ways that power can be utilized when you have it. And so what we need to demand is that Democrats use the power that they have to get rid of DeJoy, to get rid of all of the Republican ideologues who are in there, and to build a postal service that works for everybody.
Well, you know, in your show the other day, you said, let's see, Biden administration acts, the mysterious politeness of Democrats. Who does Biden represent? And this was in regard to Social Security, but you, in relation to the Postal Service, you said, why is he allowing him to sabotage his agenda?
Right.
And I think that you may have too much faith in Joe Biden. I mean, if you watch my 90-minute interview with Branko Marcetic, who wrote yesterday's Man, the case against Joe Biden, the reason it was a 90-minute interview was we went through his entire 50 years record, and he's basically a Republican. I mean, he brags about being bipartisan, but what he did in a bipartisan manner was always to get the Democrats to go along with the Republican side of things. So except for the very first year that he ran in 1972, when he made some mutterings of progressivism, because that's what 1972 was all about, he basically ran to the right of his Republican opponent. So I feel anybody, yeah, go on.
Well, I just think you hit the nail on the head in that last one. In the 1972, he said some progressive things because that's where things were in 1972. To me, Joe Biden is actually just a really classic politician. He's a middle of the pack Democrat. And so as the pack moves left or right, that's where he's going to be. I invite people, especially younger people who sort of came into political consciousness maybe around Bernie Sanders' 2016 run. And I love everyone who did. And man, have we made gains because of that. But if you want to see how bad Democrats are/were, and like the difference, just go back to like the early 2000s. Go to Bush, go to C-SPAN, and just watch old Democrat, old clips of Democrats talking, and they were horrible. They had, like, anytime they talked about anything good, they had to, the preamble was all just Republican neoliberal garbage.
Yeah.
And that's where you would find Joe Biden, right? Like right in the middle of the Democratic pack. Now, we have shifted the narrative so much. And at the exact same time, Joe Biden did learn, and this I didn't have faith when he was coming into office, but I believe this now from what he's done and some of the people he's put in power. He learned from what they did to Obama. Yeah. He learned like that they are not actually going to negotiate. And the only way to negotiate with them is from a position of strength. So when he crows bipartisan now, but then he just pushed through a $1.9 trillion relief bill, 10% of GDP on a partisan vote, which is something that Obama would not do. And that was the original sin of the Obama administration, right? The too small stimulus. That was you could hear Mitch McConnell's laughter when they passed that thing, right? Yeah. Like, and so I understand where you're coming from, but I don't trust any politician. So it's like, to me, it's all about the popular movement and what we've got now. And what the fact that DeJoy is a recognizable criminal, we're not supposed to talk about people's looks, but he looks like a villain, right? Like right here, he's just villainous. And so people get it. They don't like him. And we have a popular movement around the Postal Service right now. And I think that if we can get, and I know you have dug deep into this, if we can get things like postal banking and take away some of the power of Wall Street and add a revenue stream into the Postal Service, I mean, that's something that young people, I think, just inherently understand. Like, everyone hates the banks. Why would we want to work with the banks? Why don't we work with someone who doesn't charge me an overdraft fee? The reason I have no money that I overdrafted is because I have no money. So why are you charging me $25 for not having money?
There's a very good bill in California that just got introduced, and the California Public Banking Alliance is mobilizing support around it. And that is to provide a bank for the underbanked. And that's exactly the kind of model that, this postal bank could be. Because as you know, check cashing places, payday lenders charge usurious rates, but sometimes that's the only way that poor people can get access, to money. Before we move on to Social Security, I just want to make one more point about DeJoy. Now, he can only be removed for a cause, but isn't it a fact that he is funneling money to his logistics business? I mean, isn't that a clear conflict of interest? Isn't that illegal?
Absolutely. And so cause is this thing that, again, it's like just the difference between Democrats and Republicans are like, I want to burn this building down. And they're like, there's laws against that. And they're like, bring me my gas can, right? Like, they don't care. Cause is one of those, right? Like, there's absolutely cause. Gather up all the dead baby chickens that DeJoy killed, and calculate the harm that he created on these farmers. And that's cause. Right? Like, any of those actions that he took that are against the best interest of the American people, that's cause. So all that Biden really needs to do is clearly state what it is that he wants, and that he has an agenda for the Postal Service. And that is, again, where we end up with both the Postal Service and Social Security, is that has yet to happen. Okay. And I personally have given him a bit of slack right up until now, because now it's spring, and I'm like, I get it. It was a big deal. There's a lot of moving pieces and the relief rescue bill, but now he needs to clearly articulate his stance on the Postal Service, on DeJoy. He can say he's DeJoy's boss. He can say, you do this, DeJoy, and then if DeJoy doesn't do that, he fires him.
So how do the viewers who are watching this and want to put some pressure on Biden? Do they just call the White House? Do they tweet at him? Do they send an email? What's the best way?
Tweeting is actually right now, I think, at Ron Klein, and creating a social media environment that makes it clear. So Ron Klein is the White House Chief of Staff. So it's at WHCOS. And I would not, like, that has power. Creating a social media firestorm around this has power. The big last firestorm was driven by social media that turned into these in real life activism. You had thousands of events around the country. Just understand who's working on this. There's a lot of there's the Save Our Post Office coalition. The labor unions that represent workers at the Postal Service are amazing. American Postal Workers Union, APWU, huge champions on this, and many others, including Social Security Works. So yes, push the White House, but right now, I think if you push the Senate, push the senators, and so like if your senator is like a hero senator, right, like they're the good guys, tell them that you're pissed that DeJoy is still in there, and tell them to tell the White House.
Okay.
And then if your senator is not one of the good guy senators, tell them that you're pissed at them about DeJoy still being in there, and that they need to confirm the members of the board of governors as quickly as possible.
Well, actually, I don't think I'm going to do that, because my two senators are Tom Tillis and Richard Burr, and my congressman is Madison Cawthorn. So I think it's going to be a complete waste of time for me to write them. But everybody else should definitely.
Can I say something to that though? Just really quickly, Madison Cawthorn, to put that to the side.
Yeah.
Because I think that dude's office is probably a disaster. But your two senators, Senate offices are massive, and the Postal Service is not a partisan issue.
That's true.
It is definitely a service issue. So you can go to the constituent services person and actually bring it up in a way that you don't like what's going on with the Postal Service, right? Your mail isn't getting there on time. Yes. And these Republican offices actually do take that very seriously. And so the more we get everybody to hear, there's literally tally sheets in congressional offices where they keep notes on what people care about. And so if they're hearing about the Postal Service, they're going to actually say some stuff. And in this case, some of the Republicans might think of DeJoy as their guy, but all of the Republicans will take a shot at dinging Joe Biden about the Postal Service.
That's true. Look at Lindsey Graham down there on the border. All of a sudden, he's so concerned about the kids in cages, right?
Yes, he's very concerned. And never underestimate the shamelessness of Republicans, right? The shamelessness. Attacking them on hypocrisy is always laughable to me.
Yeah.
I'm like, they don't believe in anything. They're not hypocrites. They're nihilists. They don't believe in anything but power. So, like, yes,
Oh, yeah.
understand
They're
what motivates them.
I moved here to Asheville, and they can't do anything. In a municipality can't have rent control. They can't change the minimum wage. They can't have municipal broadband. They can't have community choice energy. No, everything. It's Dillon's rule. It's all controlled from Raleigh. So these Republicans who talk about local control and small government are total hypocrites. They're full of shit. But you gave me an idea, because Madison Cawthorn's district is mostly rural. And if those rural post office go, that's going to be, a real harm to the people. But anyway, we have spent way too long talking about this. We need to move along to Social Security, which is your major area of expertise with Social Security works. You and I talked when I did the pre-interview about what was happening with the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Because that's when I got involved and was following that. I had this theory at the time, and I still have it, that it takes a Democrat in office to do the Republican priority list. I mean, look what Bill Clinton was able to establish: NAFTA, repealing Glass-Steagall, deregulating the media, the Bankruptcy Act, the crime bill. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, these were things that if Republicans tried to pass them, they would never get it done. Now, I remember thinking at the time with Social Security and the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which was a moderate Democrat, Erskine Bowles, and a crazy radical conservative, Alan Simpson from Wyoming, that they were in the process of trying to do what so many Republican administrations had tried to do since it was first incorporated, Social Security, which was lower the benefits. And Social Security is a very popular program, of course. And they were doing this with this sneaky little thing that they thought nobody would notice, which was change the index by which the Social Security increases were given from the COLA to the chain CPI, right? Now you hear that and you start snoozing, right? Like, how boring is that? But that's really what they were trying to do. And they were being advised by the Peterson Foundation, who Pete Peterson had his whole lifelong, dream was to cut Social Security, to get rid of it pretty much, not just cut it, get rid of it. And he was the one advising this government commission. And also, I'll just mention one more point and then I'll shut up. There was also the Washington Post, who was running articles by this quote unquote news service called the Fiscal Times. And the Fiscal Times was actually an organ of the Peterson Foundation. So why don't we talk about Social Security, what happened back then, and then fast forward to what's going on now. It's a very similar situation to the Postal Service.
What's happening now is like a facsimile of what's happening in the Postal Service. So, but man, if you bring me back to the BS Commission, I got so much to say about that. But it's a joy to listen to you lay it out. All your facts are right. So the Washington Post is Fred Hyatt over there. This guy actually wrote an editorial against me and my organization personally called "Never Compromise Wins Again." And I'm never compromised, because apparently never compromising on cutting benefits is a bad thing. And in it, he says, Grover Norquist, meet Social Security works. And I'm like, is that supposed to be a dunk? Because I'm like, yeah, that's great. I definitely will not compromise on this. That's after we won. And we were holding Chris Van Hollen's feet to the fire when he ran for Senate, because he served on the BS Commission. And although he wasn't a leading proponent of any of the things that were coming out of there, we want all Democrats to realize that even playing footsie with the austerity folks is anathema to your career. And there's no one who supports. The only thing that people hate more than Social Security cuts is Social Security cuts by an unaccountable commission that happens behind closed doors. And that's what Obama tried to do. And in furtherance of your setup, the most dangerous setup for Social Security, in my opinion, and the evidence points to, is divided government. It's when there's a Democrat in the White House and Republicans controlling the Congress, because then the elite media, they just start hammering this deficit deficit, deficit. And then the siren song of the grand bargain starts. And the grand bargain has got to be just the dumbest concept ever. They're like, well, if we take things that both sides hate and we do them together, then everyone will get hated equally by all of their people. And somehow that'll be a win. It's this asinine theory in Washington, D.C. It's actually the Acela corridor. So it goes from Wall Street to D.C. and it exists nowhere else. That there's this whole concept of the socially liberal, economically conservative person, right? And you're like, those people don't exist. Have you ever been out in this country? Outside of the editorial boards of newspapers, that doesn't exist. If anything, people are super economically liberal and then more socially conservative. And that's something that we can work on. But like that whole idea that there's all these people who are like, well, the bond vigilantes, you got to worry about that. And in order to satisfy the bloodlust of the bond vigilantes, we're going to sacrifice our children and our grandparents by cutting Social Security benefits. Isn't that great? Oh, by the way, we're going to raise your taxes too. And you're like, what realm are you in? But they get cheered as brave, right? It's like by doing a really stupid thing, they get rewarded as brave. And my job at the time, we formed to defeat the BS Commission. So first I switched it from the Simpson Bowles to the Bowles-Simpson Commission. So then I could shorthand it the BS Commission. And I could then go on TV and say the BS Commission and their BS report to cut Social Security. And I got in an argument with Alan Simpson. He went on TV and he said, don't call it the BS Commission because then people are going to think that it's bull hockey. And because he always has this fake bonhomie. He's like one of my least favorite political characters. He's like, I'm just a salt of the earth guy. My daddy was the governor and a senator, just a normal guy. And you're like, no, you're not. You're a plutocrat, dude.
Like George W. Bush.
Exactly. Just that character is my least favorite character. I'll take like an elitist over that even, like that fake bonhomie or salt of the earth thing. We defeated the Bowles-Simpson Commission with very few allies. Bernie Sanders was our major ally there. Tom Harkin was also a huge, he was one of the first senators to just say absolutely not. And he stood up to Obama. And he pushed for expanding Social Security. And we were able to do it by just telling people what was going on and saying, this is what's happening in DC. They're coming after your Social Security. And they want to do it because, Pete Peterson, this billionaire, not only was he advising, he actually had a staff member. So Pete Peterson funds the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which gets touted in all of these stories as some sort of nonpartisan expert. They're just a partisan organization aimed to destroy programs that work for the American people. And they had one of their staffers, Mark Goldwine, actually worked for the BS Commission. So it wasn't like at arm's length. And they didn't pay his salary. He was still paid by Peterson dollars as he crafted the BS report. And if you read the BS report now, and I really invite your readers to do so. Zach Carter did this just recently on Twitter, who is an amazing journalist. And he just looked at it and he just read like some of the intro paragraphs of it. And the whole thing is wrong, right? They're like, if we don't do this, the interest rates are going to skyrocket and we'll be paying more interest than principal in 2 years. And it's all of this painting this picture of an insolvent United States of America. And none of that stuff happened. Absolutely none of it happened. You think if you're wrong 100% of the time, your opinion would be devalued in DC. But that's just not what happens. These same people are still around, which leads to the second part of your question about what's happening now.
Well, first I want to get back to Social Security. Explain to people how it's financed, because it is should be self-financing, and it shouldn't have anything to do with the debt and the deficit. And I credit the Occupy movement with shifting the national conversation from the phony issue of the debt and deficit, because we can see now, of course, that when we want to spend money on endless wars or tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires, or even now with the COVID relief bill and the CARES Act and the HEROES Act and the infrastructure thing, nobody seems to care about deficits. And then, of course, we could talk about, but we won't, modern monetary theory, which means that that's not even how you finance things through the taxes. But why don't you tell people a little bit about how Social Security is funded, and is it in danger in reality?
Yeah, so this is one of those ones I definitely will, but I bet you all of your listeners know how Social Security is funded because they see it coming out of our paychecks, right? We pay for it. It's ours. No one is giving us any money. We see it. It's in our paychecks. It goes out every 2 weeks. It goes in. That's what pays for Social Security. Me, I pay for it. You pay for it. Everyone who's working pays for it, for them and their families. Those withholdings, so the FICA is the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, because Social Security is a social insurance program. It's that premium that is paid into Social Security comes back in the form of benefits, and 99 cents of every dollar paid in comes back in the form of benefits. Only 1 penny goes to administer the entire system. And that's why Wall Street hates it, because Wall Street sees that and sees a missed opportunity. They'd
Right.
whack on another 20, 25% as an administrative fee so they could buy another golden yacht or go to Burning Man, whatever they want to do with their money. But that
it should be pointed out that Pete Peterson was the chairman of the Blackstone Group, which is
Yeah.
the largest investment firm. And our government is so indebted to the Blackstone Group right now because we're essentially almost borrowing money from them. Wouldn't you say that? Federal Reserve too. I mean, we should be able, the Treasury Department should not have to go to private banks and pay interest on our own damn money.
yes.
That's the scheme that they've got going here.
It is, and you know what Pete Peterson did back in the 80s was he bought American companies and he stole pension funds, which they called at the time overvalued assets, and then sold them off as pieces, and then made $3 billion, fabulous amounts of wealth. He's right before the Michael Milken leveraged buyout era. He's the buyout era, and then after he made his money destroying private pensions, he came after public pensions. It's just an ideological driven thing to destroy this government program that works so it can be replaced with a worse private system that doesn't work but makes a handful of people fantastically wealthy. And it's
Sort
the
of
same
like how pensions were replaced by 401.
401ks. Exactly. Yeah. And the only winners from that, Wall Street.
Mhm.
Workers are left holding a bag of dreams and hope, and
Right.
Wall Street has yachts. There's a book that was written after the Great Depression called "Where Are the Customers' Yachts?" and it's so on point still today. It's about based on the idea of this sort of yokel banker who goes to Washington D.C. To Wall Street, and he's talking to a big shot there. And the big shot showing him all of the bankers' boats, and this small town guy's like, "Oh, well, where are the customers' yachts?" And that's the whole punchline. Like, the customers don't have yachts; the bankers have the yachts. That's the joke. That's what we're dealing with. It's like we overcomplicate the ideas so that it seems like we're helpless and hopeless and It's only going to go in one direction. But really,
that's why they don't want public banks. I mean,
exactly.
Talking about when the nation was founded, all the colonies had public banks.
Absolutely.
Like right now, the only bank left is the Bank of North Dakota. And they were able to stay afloat during this whole financial collapse because they didn't play casino capitalism, take all those mortgages and put them into tranches and, sell them off to sovereign wealth funds. And that's what the repeal of Glass-Steagall brought us, is the ability, and so many pension funds, right? Even public pension funds like CalPERS and CalSTRS would invest in these exotic instruments, and all those people lost their pensions. I mean, I think it's come back up right now, but a lot of people are going out of business, and the pension funds are going along with that. It's very sad.
And that's what we're going to talk forever. We should just do more shows
we'll do more shows, but let's talk about what's happening with the Board of Governors right now and what we need to do.
So in Social Security, there's no Board of Governors. And the one thing with Social Security is it's simpler. So there's a commissioner and a deputy commissioner. They're Trumpists, Andrew Saul and David Black, and they need to be fired right now. Call it whatever you want, forced out, asked to resign. I don't care. Make it polite as you want. They need to be gone today because these guys delayed 30 million people's relief checks, stimulus checks, survival checks. And these are checks that are going to people on Social Security. So you have seniors, people with disabilities, but also people on SSI, who are some of the most vulnerable people in this country. And they were watching the news and seeing that this happened and expecting these $1,400 checks to come in, and then they didn't. And the last two did, right? The $600 one, that's the first half of this $1,400 one. Under the only difference is that it happened under Trump. That one was direct deposited right into people's accounts. Saul and David Black is the smart one, actually. He comes up with the ideas. David Saul is just this sort of empty suit who feels entitled to the position because he's fabulously wealthy and is given, and always has been, and has given all of this money to the Republicans. But these guys did it. They sabotaged the American Rescue Plan for seniors, for people with disabilities, and it was aimed at harming Joe Biden. And they got caught red-handed by the House Ways and Means Committee. So the Democrats on the House Ways and Means Committee were like bulldogs on this. And, you know, I will hold Democrats to account when they need to, but when they do the right thing, they should also be given their kudos. I loved this. They gave him a letter and they said, you have 24 hours to fix this. And he did. He got the data over to IRS and the checks are starting to go out now. And, you know, but that doesn't stop me, like, that he did it. He didn't give IRS what they needed because it was the right thing to do. Is because he got his hand caught in the cookie jar by the House Ways and Means Committee. We have both the Senate chair on the Social Security Subcommittee, Sherrod Brown, the House chair on the Social Security Subcommittee, John Larson, and dozens of other elected members of the House and Senate who say, we got to get rid of these guys. We have both unions, AFGE, Council 220, and the AALJs, who are the administrative law judges. The workforce of Social Security Administration says, we got to get rid of these guys. We cannot work with them. And then the grassroots, seniors and folks with disabilities, who these guys have actively attacked for the whole Trump administration. And on the way out the door, they're trying to put through a policy on continuing disability reviews that, when it was implemented under Reagan, led directly to thousands of deaths, people committing suicide because they were going to lose their benefits and they couldn't face the world knowing that they'd be disabled and on the street. And so they chose to take their own life. I mean, this is like, it was so horrible that even in the Reagan era, there was a unanimous Senate bill to reverse this policy when Reagan did it. They tried to do it in the twilight of the Trump administration. And if Trump had won, this thing would have been on nitro to just go right through. And it actually rips people's benefits away from them. It doesn't only block them from getting it, which is the other thing that they do. So these guys are just, they are garbage. They have to be put to the curb. They have to be taken to the curb. And, you know, I can be mean about it. Maybe Joe Biden has to be polite about it, but time's up. They have to go now. And so it's really simple.
Is it the same pressure points? We tweeted Biden, we tweeted our senators.
Absolutely. And this one I would tweet at it should be pointed at Biden. There's very little other things, right? He's the shot caller. There's no board. There's no like thing that you have to do. Hammer him and the White House chief of staff and just let him know that these guys got to go. If again, let your local officials know as well, your House and your two senators, that's good because they should be hearing about it so they know. But really, this is a Joe Biden call.
Yeah. All right. Now, moving on to the third and final segment of our show, which is these three bills that Bernie Sanders introduced to rein in big pharma. And one of them is designed to index the price of popular drugs according to the global market. A second will give Medicare the opportunity to pay for drugs through a competitive bidding process. And the third would allow Americans to buy drugs at cheaper prices from foreign sellers. And people who are familiar with Bernie Sanders' history and his two campaigns know that he's been trying all of these things for a very long time. You actually wrote the companion bill to one of these bills, that Ro Khanna introduced in the House. Why don't you talk about that?
So I'd put it a little differently. It's my policy that I gave to Ro Khanna, who's a super champion on this. And Ro brought it to Bernie, and then Bernie signed on to Ro's bill. And so, technically it's the Khanna-Sanders bill, but Khanna was like, yes, this is fantastic, because Sanders then ran with it. And their office wrote it. They wrote the bill.
But you're the mastermind.
It's my idea, along with a movement who understands that pharma is a sociopathic industry whose greed kills. And when you give a company a monopoly over something that people need to live, like insulin, then you ask, well, economists always say, like, what's somebody's willingness to pay? And you're like, well, what's your willingness to pay for your life or your child's life or your spouse's life? It's every dollar that you have and every dollar that you can borrow. And these sociopaths, they set the price at what the market can bear. But in this case, what that means is a body count. It means they want a few people to die, right? They want a few headlines out there about people dying from rationing their insulin so that everyone else is terrified enough that they will pay whatever they can to get insulin. And if you don't believe me at how bad it is, just go to GoFundMe and type in insulin, and you will see just this massive ecosystem of people who have to beg to stay alive. That's the industry that we're talking about. And so there's a whole movement of us. But yes, I definitely played a role in that bill, and it's the best one. It's the perfect bill. What it does, just automatically. So a lot of other bills, we have to involve the Secretary of HHS, which means that sometimes when a Republican's in charge, you could have a really terrible secretary like Alex Azar, who literally ran one of those insulin companies. And then when a Democrat's in charge, it would be a good secretary like Becerra. So you could see like drug prices going up and down depending on who's in the White House. The Sanders bill actually just says, we're going to automatically take a price. The price is a basket of other countries. And we're going to say, match this price, the average of these 5 countries. And if you don't, we're just going to let generic companies come in and produce that drug. There's a million other beautiful provisions in there. You might have heard earlier. I love redress of grievances. We actually also allow everybody to say, I think my drug prices are too high. And so there's a petitioning process that would automatically start the process as well. So we would turn the sentinel provisions, right? Like, who's going to say if drug prices are too high or not? And we're like, well, let the people say. Let the people say if their drug prices are too high, they'll petition the government to lower them. And then it just does it, right? It says, okay, offer this price or you're going to lose your monopoly. And here's like the thing. A lot of policy building is you just stitch together different pieces of it, right? So the big thing is the compulsory licensing or the competitive licensing, saying to a company that if you don't lower the prices, you lose your monopoly. And that is a fundamental shift in thinking that we have to get people to understand, that these pharmaceutical companies, they don't create the drugs. We create them. Right. NIH, taxpayer dollars, we create the drugs. And then we pay to grant a monopoly, which is, I won't go too deep into it, but it's like an inverse tax. We pay to grant a monopoly, and then we pay the highest drug prices in the world. We give these companies the power to rip us off. And all we're saying is, like, take the power away. If they're ripping us off so bad, take the power away from them. And so you want to talk about where it's going. It's important to look at the component pieces of it, right? So like the whole bill, we're not going to see any of the whole bills that are out there probably get across the finish line, but some pieces of all of them are. In the House, you have the bill HR 3, which I also was very involved in the pugilistic fight to make it better. And I created a few people who still don't like me on the House side and the Democratic caucus, because they think I'm a little too mean when it comes to fighting for lower drug prices. But in the end, it's really good. And so they should send me flowers and say thank you, because I made their bill a lot better. In that bill, it does not have competitive licensing. So that was one of the big fights that we had, and we didn't win on competitive licensing, but we did win on some other things. In that bill, the stick that they use, or right, like the thing that forces pharma to act, is a large tax. So they say, we're going to negotiate a price. We're going to use a basket of countries as to set it. So it's the same thing. We're going to look at other countries, and we're going to say there's an average, and we're going to go to the company and say, give us this price. And if you don't, and in fact, in HR 3, the big problem is it's only a subset of drugs, and we want it to be all drugs, like Bernie's bill. And they say the price should be 120% of the average of the other countries. And I'm like, why? If you're writing the law, why not just be like it's 80%, right? Like whatever, you have the pen, but it's 120% of the average. And then if you don't do that, they get hit with a huge tax, and the taxes will move them. It's very big. It would be very difficult for a company not to move. But we still think that taking the monopoly away is the surest way to ensure lower prices and access. So we know that pharma companies are so sociopathic that when they think about losing money, they would actually rather withdraw the drug from market. They did this in England. England just sets the price. We're the only country in the world that is macroly stupid enough to not set the price, right? We're like, yeah, just charge us whatever you think is fair.
Yeah.
And in England, there's a cystic fibrosis drug. So kids with cystic fibrosis, CF, they need this drug to live a meaningful, a life that is not just a horrible amounts of pain and a shorter life. I mean, like to think of what they did, you have to understand that they are hurting children, right? More than just children, but a lot of children in immense pain. And instead, so the NHS over in England said, you're charging too much, we're going to pay less. And the company, Vertex, which is a US company, just withdrew the drug from market. And then here's where you see the real sociopaths. They called the press in and they told them they were doing this. And so there's photographs of these wood chippers that they're throwing the drug into. They're destroying the drug that children need to live instead of just making slightly less money.
Yeah.
So when that's the industry that you're up against, like, don't ever think that they're going to do the right thing.
I think they're all like that. I don't remember if it was Walmart or another company, but when the employees finally won their union vote, they decided to shut the store down.
Right.
Let me ask you about generics, because one thing I remember when I was fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership was that it would extend already the very lengthy time that the brand name could have the monopoly before the generic could come in. And you alluded to the fact that we pay for the research, the government pays for the research, or universities pay for the research. So when they try to say they need to have this monopoly, as long as they do, it's really bullshit. Do any of these bills address that?
Like basically all of them, or not all of them, the ones that I just was talking about, they address the fact that the ones that use competitive licensing, it's square front and center, right? Because what they're saying is you're going to lose your monopoly, and generics are going to be able to come in and produce this drug right away. And so when that's the stick that is being used, it absolutely addresses the fact that these companies, that we could go on for another like hour and a half on, because here's what the reality is. The universities are also funded by taxpayer grants, right? So it's actually taxpayer funded. Every single of the last 250 molecules produced, every single one of them, the riskiest stage in the research and development was entirely funded by us. Not a single drug has been discovered that didn't have all of the early stage research funded by us, and up to, and they make it really hard to figure out, but up to a third of the drugs actually had public funding all the way through. So the entire life cycle development of the drug was paid for by the public. It's the scientists are paid for by the public, and then the companies get the monopoly. And then where they come in, and their innovation is just amazing. They innovate every day, new ways to extend the monopoly. They
Yeah.
have never done innovation on how to make people's lives better. But when it comes to
those names they come up with, it never
Yes.
ceases to amaze me. These creative names they make out of non-words.
Maybe that is they also have some.
innovation.
Yeah, maybe they do some innovative naming, but so there's
And
many
marketing,
drugs.
of course, innovative marketing.
Innovative marketing.
Why is our country the only country where they're allowed to advertise on TV?
It's us in New Zealand, and it's just corruption. You know, they when it comes to pharma, you really have to like fully get into your brain whoever you think of as like the most evil character, right? Like Cobra and G.I. Joe or something like that. Whatever. They're really, really evil. And so
I would say the big fossil fuels, big oil kind of ties.
Yeah, extractive industry and pharma are like similar levels, but pharma's tactics are even more brutal than the extractive industries, because pharma knows that they don't even own any drills, right? Like they don't even own any equipment. They actually own nothing but pictures of molecules. And if the government says that those patents are not real, then the entire thing goes poof, right? So their tactics when it comes to corruption are unparalleled. And the biggest one to see this is you remember when Medicare Part D was created, right? Medicare Part D is great because it means that seniors can get, and some people with disabilities can get prescription drugs paid for through Medicare. And the problem is, it was the guy who was in charge of it, of shepherding this thing through, Billy Towson. He actually switched parties so that he could continue to shepherd this thing through. And the reason he existed was to make this one phrase that said, Medicare cannot negotiate drug prices. They can't actually, they'll just pay whatever pharma says.
And then he went on to be the head of
exactly. The day after he resigned from Congress to become the head of pharma at $1 million a year salary.
Yeah.
I mean, they're shameless. And
I mean, that happened with Robert Rubin too. Remember?
Definitely.
As Clinton's Treasury Secretary, he made it possible. I mean, Graham Leach Bliley, that bill got all the credit, but really Robert Rubin as Treasury Secretary was fully supportive of it. And it enabled Travelers to merge with Citibank. And then he became the head of the conglomerate Citicorp after he left, you know. So they're so corrupt. But let's talk about the chances of it getting passed. Now, Biden, one good thing about him, he's starting to realize that, like you said, he's not going to get support from the Republicans. He's not even trying. I mean, he's making maybe token verbal entreaties. But like Mitch McConnell said, he has only had one meeting with him since he became president. So he's doing this through reconciliation. How many of these bills, or how many parts of these bills, do you think will be able to get into reconciliation, to get into the overall infrastructure bill or whatever's coming next? And how many of them will pass? Because remember, they tried to say that the $15, the parliamentarian said that the $15 minimum wage was not, didn't have a budget impact or something.
Right.
So talk about that.
Incidental to the budget. Here's like a lot of things happen in DC, but here's where we are right now. There's two things that are definitely going to be in the next reconciliation package, which everyone calls a recon 2 here. Infrastructure, huge amounts of spending on infrastructure, and drug prices, lowering people's drug prices. The contours of what that drug price piece looks like are up for negotiation. And I actually think, and this is weird, and I don't think I can put it into words, but the slimness of the majorities in the House and Senate that the Democrats have actually make it like it's so sort of easier, it seems, to get through big things, because they can't lose one from either side, right? Like you can't lose Bernie Sanders or Joe Manchin. And they can't be negotiating with Mitch McConnell because they got to spend all their time negotiating with Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and Bernie Sanders, right? And they have to come up with something that 50 senators will vote for. And we saw $1.9 trillion, $1,900 billion just passed with 50 senators. It's a pretty amazing accomplishment. So what we're looking at with drug pricing is still up in the air, but I can give you the sort of like what is most likely to happen. The House will pass H.R. 3 again. They already passed it last Congress. And very importantly, it has a CBO score. And the CBO score is big. It saves a lot of money. It saves big time money. And you can make it save more. Like the more progressive you make the bill, the closer you get to Bernie Sanders' bill, the bigger the savings are. And it saves money. I always want to make sure makes sense. It saves me money. It saves me money directly because my drug prices will go down. It also saves the government money because what the government pays for drugs will go down. And those are the savings that I'm talking about, is like Medicare will pay less, right? The federal part of Medicaid will pay less. And the sums are huge, $500 billion. So the biggest difference between drug prices and basically everything else out there is that drug prices saves money. Doing the right thing on drug prices and taking on pharma actually saves money. You can use lowering drug prices to pay for building highways, right? Like that is a really good thing to have. So that's part of the reason why I think that drug prices will happen. It'll be something like H.R. 3 will be the starting point, what the House passed. It'll come over to the Senate, and then you're going to see plus or minus from H.R. 3. So progressives are going to be trying to make it better, and conservatives and pharma will be trying to make it worse. And this is just a rule that I come up with or evidence by history, which is that nothing gets better in the Senate. So I think H.R. 3 is going to be the high mark, or whatever comes out of the House. We're going to try to make it better in the House too. But whatever comes out of the House is going to get, chewed up a little bit in the Senate, and it'll come out. It'll be something like negotiation, Medicare negotiation. Hopefully it's just drug price negotiation. So it's all drugs, not just under Medicare, but all drugs for everybody are negotiated. And then we'll be sort of haggling over which pieces to put in there. We're going to be pushing for compulsory licensing or competitive licensing as hard as we can. I think that that's a really tough sell. I think Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema will probably say no to taking monopolies away, but it'll help us set the debate high. And Bernie Sanders had a really boss move. And the reason we're talking about this is because Bernie Sanders was the first mover. He had a hearing. He knows that this is going to happen. He had a hearing and help, and he laid out his 3 bills. And he's like, this is where the discussion will start. Right. So we're starting where Bernie said it with this beautiful bill, compulsory licensing, automatic, basket of countries. And then I think on the other side, you have something lower. Last Congress, Senator Wyden and Senator Grassley negotiated this bipartisan thing, but in DC speak, that's bipartisan, but it only gets 4 Republicans. So it's not like it gets enough to get it right. You need 10. So it's bipartisan, but it doesn't move it. But you can sort of see that as the floor. And that one is not lowering the price. It's not taking it out of pharma. It's basically it's saying people on Medicare will pay less. It's going to reduce their out-of-pocket costs. But that's just, again, that's like, we're going to pay for that in another way, right? Like you're not lowering the cost or price. You're just lowering what people pay that particular time.
Right. Now, so what should people be writing their senators and Congress people about? Should they just say in the reconciliation bill, please lower our drug prices? Because there's too many bills to keep track of.
Yeah, yes, they should remove the please, and they should say, my drug prices are too damn high, and it's your fault. And if you don't get my drug prices down, you're going to lose your job. And we're sick of this. We've done this so many times. Yeah. So many cycles. It's been promised. Right. Now they can get it done. Yeah. And if they don't get it done, they'll be held to account, both Democrats and Republicans.
Right. And the beauty of this is that it's through reconciliation, because I think back to the last time It seemed like such a sure thing. I think it was called Proposition 61. It was in California. It was on the ballot. I think it was 2017.
I fought on that one.
Bernie
Brutal.
came out 3 times to do rallies for it. I covered one of them. And the nurses union were doing the organizing for it. And prior to the big pharma doing ads against it, they're lying ads. The general public was in support of it. But by the time they finished their advertising blitz, it went down to defeat. So that's what goes, and Bernie, was the one who told me that they are the biggest lobbyists. But more than any other industry, how many lobbyists they have. What is it, like 7 lobbyists per congressperson or something like that?
Yeah, or more. It depends on how you're calculating it, because you should just say they have an army, and their army in DC is so there's lobbyists and then there's lobbyists, and they have that second one. They have former senators, they have former leadership people from the House, and they have Democrats and they have Republicans. They have old chiefs of staff. Their most demoralizing tactic. I've been doing this for a while, over a decade. I moved to Washington, D.C. to dismantle the pharmaceutical industry and build something based on justice in the wreckage. I moved here and got my master's to do it. The most demoralizing thing they do is they take good staffers. You're working with a staffer and they're really good at drug prices. And so you think of them, you're like, oh, all right, we're on the same page. And then they go and work for a lobbying shop that works for Pharma. And you're like, ooh, that one stung. So they really they create a brain drain. So they take the expertise out. And so what it comes down to is you have some champions, and there's more and more and more now. And that's so good. We used to have these pharma Dems who were shameless. Now the Democrats who like pharma are scared of that relationship. And that's what we want. We want their money to be toxic. Yeah. I give a ton of credit to Senator Cory Booker. He took a ton of heat for this vote he had in Vote-A-Rama, and he should have gotten a lot of heat for that. But then he said, you know what? I'm going to stop taking all pharmaceutical money. And this is the senator from New Jersey, which is Pharma's backyard.
Right.
We want that everywhere. So when it comes to drug prices, I'm going to keep it simple right now. It's my drug prices are too high. I want lower drug prices now. And I'm not going to take any excuses. And if you are taking pharma money and then you're voting against a bill that lowers my drug prices, I'm going to fire you.
Let me ask you something before we move on to force the vote. And do you have time? Because we've gone over. So we could.
My son has not banged on the door yet. I'm not getting messages saying that I'm too loud. So let's have at it. I love this conversation. It's great.
Okay, well, you're great, and it's going to be a perfect lead in to force the vote because you're so in the weeds and you understand how complicated these things are. But before we leave big pharma, speaking about taking money, it's a known fact that James Clyburn takes the most money from any senator. Do you think that's why he was so intent on stopping Bernie Sanders?
I don't know. Bernie's a threat to a lot, and he still is, and his power is massive still. When the establishment lined up to ensure, I was a Bernie Sanders surrogate during the campaign, so I went to Iowa and I spoke to seniors for him. The establishment is scared of what we're saying. We're winning, but they're still scared. And the part that I think a lot of activists are not as engaged in, I know in California, there's like a change, and we just saw Nevada on this, but it's the actual party structure. So it's actually, like the party is really important for getting elections done. Is why third parties in this country have to start at the local level or they're not real. And if you're not getting local municipal things power built, then you're just a grifter or whatever. But the party structure on the Democratic side is really, really bad. State parties are bad. And Bernie Sanders is a lot of threat to that because his whole thing is not built on that structure. He does not rely on that structure to win.
Right.
But that structure beat him, right? Like so it's like he built a grassroots army, and like, man, did we have an amazing shot, and man, did they have to like line up quickly, right? And they had Rachel Maddow and corporate media just like, remember after Nevada, you remember Nevada. I mean,
I remember when Chris Jansen and she said, and Bernie Sanders came in first. I mean, there was like this audible sigh, right?
And their analysis was, if Democrats don't line up behind one of these other candidates, Bernie Sanders is literally going to win. Do you get what I'm saying, people? Like,
yeah.
From then,
Obama got Buttigieg and Klobuchar to drop out and endorse Biden, who, in my opinion, was the weakest of the centrists. He wasn't going anywhere. And I will never forgive Obama for that. And quite frankly, I'm not happy that Bernie took the bait. You know, I feel he could have continued to campaign, but I already did a show on that. He could have changed it up to a mutual aid type of campaign, and I think he could have won, but, you know, they intimidated him. They said, even though Joe Biden was telling people to go out and vote, you know, when Bernie was still in there, afterwards, it was like, oh no, don't go to the polls, right? But let's go to force the vote, because like I said at the beginning of the show, I haven't really talked about this on the show because I'm not one to be a circular firing squad, you know? And I think that's what that whole debate has become, where it has really divided at least left Twitter. I would say most of the country, most of the leftists in the country don't know who Jimmy Dore is or what Force the Vote was all about. But it sure has divided leftists on Twitter. Even people who I know who are Medicare for All activists were supporting that strategy, which I found completely unstrategic. And I could share my views as to why I thought it was, but first I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a strategy. So I have lots of thoughts on it. I'll keep it sort of quick. It wasn't a strategy. It was a gimmick. And so to think that you can actually get something as complex as Medicare for All, you know, Social Security works. I was in the room with Pramila. We were part of the groups that helped write the new bill. And just the distance from, I've been doing this since a long time. I'm not going to tell people like that means I know more than them, but I might, because I actually was working with John Conyers on 676, right? And the distance from 676 to when Bernie put in his bill, that bill is amazing. And then Pramila polishes up some of the rough edges there, and each iteration gets better and better. And we're building support, and that's what it takes to actually get this done. Because I work on like Medicare policy, and I work in the weeds on rules and regulations, I know like there's no way you can gimmick this stuff because it's massive. It has to go through the committees. It has to actually get marked up. It's got like all of these things have to happen. So the idea that you could force this vote, they even admit, they're like, it would fail, but then we would know who's on whose side. And I'm like, I know, we know
who the co-sponsors are, right? And then they're saying, oh, but it's just performative that they're co-sponsoring. And if they really had to vote, then we would see.
Yeah,
but no, we wouldn't see, because when there's only 115 of them, they all could vote for it and it would still fail.
And the other thing is, I mean, and we could probably talk of this for a while, but so I have two things on it. One is it wasn't a real strategy. And if anyone had like sat down, we could have talked it out, and they probably would have said, okay, because we have what DC, what our work looks like, it's spreadsheets. We have spreadsheets upon spreadsheets upon spreadsheets. I know where everyone stands. I know where not only the members stands, but like where their chief stands, where their LD stands, right? Like, do we have an ally at the staff level? But the boss
power mapping.
It's exactly. We know exactly where. We don't need any more information on that. What we need is to move the people who aren't with us to get with us. And the only way to do that is through building a popular movement. So the idea that you could do it as a trick in DC, that's the part that was like bananas to me. Like, no, it's not going to be one in DC. It's going to be won in the streets. It's going to be won in popular movement. It's going to be won when the din and the clamor of the people is unavoidable to these politicians. Politicians are lagging indicators. If you're looking to a politician to lead, you're going to lose every single time. You have to create the conditions that force the politicians to act. That's what you have to do, not force the vote. You have to force politicians to just carry this thing all the way across the finish line. And that's what we're doing. So I have all that opinion, but then I also am like, that there is you can basically just remove this whole discussion by using the mute button on Twitter, like 17 times, like mute, and then the whole thing disappears because it really does only exist on a sliver of very online left. But it was annoying to me because I felt like we had failed some as well as organizers, that we hadn't created an inviting enough campaign of building this popular fight, and that people are hurting right now. And so they went after this gimmick, right? Like they went after the snake oil. And I'm like, I get it.
It was always phrased like this. If we can't get Medicare for all in a pandemic, when can we get it? So it was the fierce urgency of now.
And we should have made it clear, like, look, policy advocacy and organizing is cod liver oil. It's not snake oil, right? It's gross. It's hard work. It's slow. It's deliberate. It can be flashy, and we should have. It's annoying to me because I bet you we lost some really good activists, right? Like people whose names I don't know, but they might have been with us as we were pushing for getting new co-sponsors. They might have been our digital army, and we should have been aligned together. Like solidarity is the only way you beat the bosses.
Exactly. It totally divided the left because they were, first of all, they were calling AOC a sellout. They had that hashtag fraud squad. And then when DSA and the nurses didn't get behind it, they called them sellouts too. I mean, the very groups that have been on the ground organizing for Medicare for all for years. Can you imagine?
Exactly. That's the part that, so just, and I don't know, we can keep going as long as you want on this. I have lots of opinions, but I'm also like, yes, I'm a nice person, and you know, like I fight for the side that I think is the good guy side. You know, we're fighting for justice. I have a moral imperative for a preferential option for the poor. All of those things. I'm also a mean guy too. And I'm mean, and I'm still a human. And so when you attack me and my allies who I've been in the trenches with for years, and you're calling them and I don't even know who you are. Like, who are you? I know who these people are. I've been organizing with them in church basements for freaking decades. And you're going to call them sellouts? You're going to come after them? And I'm like, I will come after you. I will never work with you. I will never work with anyone who works with you. And like, that's reality. I'm sorry. But like, you know, they shot themselves in the foot as well, because I hold grudges. They think that they're the ones holding grudges, but like they forget that grudges can have two sides. I hold grudges. I want to invite the activists over to us. And I want the people who want to fight for justice and for single payer to come in with all of their fierce urgency of now, with all of their everything they've got on it. But I will not forgive some of the leaders of this thing for the shots they took at our champions, at my friends, and at organizers. You know, like, I get politicians, like whatever, not whatever, but public figures. But coming after, when he went after DSA and the nurses, right? I'm like, what? Are you kidding me?
And here's the thing about AOC, because I got into it with Ryan Knight, who's Amped Up podcast, and he's the socialist, and he was with Movement for People's Party, and then he dropped off without explaining why he dropped off, and we could do a whole show about that. But, you know, he was just going on last night about AOC's interview with DSA and how she referred to people as bad faith actors because they were attacking her. And she didn't name him, but he took it as that she was referring to him. And then he went after her again. And I just in a moment of frustration, I just wrote, oh my God, I said, what have you, you know, what have you done for Medicare for all this week? Have you phone banked? Have you canvassed? Have you organized the citizen lobby meeting? And then people went after me, people who I've been following for a long time. Somebody called me, fuck off, Lauren. How can you say that to Ryan? You know how hard he works. And my explanation was just, look, I feel what they're doing is they're so negative against people who are, like the first thing I learned in my Marshall Gans class, Leadership, Organizing, and Action. And he's the one who was behind the entire organizing for Obama campaign, the largest up until Bernie, the largest people-powered grassroots movement behind a presidential candidate ever. He said that you have to find out who your allies are, who your supporters are, and bring them in. You don't attack them. You don't take someone like AOC just because she's gone from being an activist to a legislator, where things are very different. Once you're in office and you're in a body of 435 other people, you have to compromise. You have to pick your battles. You have to, wait your turn, survey the land, and you have to continue to build power. So everything that they're objecting to her not doing, she's not doing it because it simply wouldn't be an effective tactic as a legislator. She would marginalize herself. Do you not agree on that?
I do. I learned very similar lessons from Marion Barry, who's mayor for life from DC, the late Marion Barry. He was also MLK's muscle. He was an amazing man, and he created the Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program. One of the single greatest policy accomplishments I think one person can do. And he had some bad parts of him as well, but that's humanity. But man, I was organizing in Southeast Washington, D.C. with my now business partner, Kimon Freeman at We Act Radio. We were fighting to fight HIV in Washington, D.C. And so we wanted free condom distribution. We wanted needle exchanges. We wanted just the prioritization of it brought up. And I was young. I worked in an HIV clinic, and I was pretty hardcore, in my estimation. When people weren't with me, I was like, you're the worst. You're a sellout. You're never going to be on our side. And Marion Barry just sat me down because he didn't support us right away. But then when he saw that we were bringing a real thing, he came over and he said a few things that still always stick with me as like some of the best political wisdom I've heard. And it's similar to what you were saying. Number one, don't punch somebody in the face when they're walking to you. And what he meant was when you win someone over to your side, then they're on your side. Don't punch them in the face because they're walking to you. That's a surefire way to make sure that no one comes in to your movement, right? If your movement is toxic and you're just punching in the face all the time, no one's going to want to organize with you. You got to be inviting. You got to be this is where the cool kids are. This is where we fight for justice. And we're not going to punch you in the face if you want to, come over and learn.
Yeah, there's a term I've learned. It's called calling someone in, don't call them out.
Out, exactly. I don't know why, but these were all punch metaphors. But Marion Barry, if you don't know the history of Marion Barry, people, the corporate media try to just set him up as.
Remember is the cocaine.
Exactly. They tried to destroy him, and no one is like, well, why did the DEA set up the mayor of Washington, D.C.? So people should learn about Marion Barry. But the other thing he said is that the problem on the left, and this is a guy who came up through the civil rights movement, is that too often they punch the person who's standing right next to them. And what he means by that is that we direct our advocacy or our organizing at those who are closest to us because it's easiest to reach them, right? So you're saying AOC's the problem, and you're like, no, AOC is the closest person to you. The problem would be a Josh Gottheimer on the other side, but it's difficult to see how we can impact the people who are further away from us. How can we use our power to impact the people? But the people in our milieu, in our section of the world, it's easier for us to impact them. And so generally, that's who we're going to focus on because it's easy. And what he was saying to me at that time was that I was being dumb and lazy. or unstrategic, unwise, and I didn't put enough hustle into it. Like, it's easy to blame your ideological allies for just not trying hard enough, right? It's easy to do that. It's difficult to understand that there's a whole structure and system out there that's
Right.
set up, and you have to play within that. You can't just flip the board over. Once in a blue moon, way rarer than blue moons, there might be a chance where the board gets shooken up, and I think we're in one of those right now. And so we have to be able to make as many gains as possible. But you're not going to get it by being like, the person who believes 90% like me is the problem over that last 10%.
Right.
That's,
and it's also, the Nancy Pelosi thing. I mean, there was nobody else. I asked, I participated in a virtual fundraiser for Roe and Pramila. And I had heard AOC answer a question by Jake Tapper. He said, are you going to vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker? And she said, if no one more progressive comes along. So on that virtual fundraiser, I asked the question, would either of you challenge Nancy Pelosi for Speaker? And Pramila said no. She was enjoying, running the Progressive Caucus, and she had a lot of plans for that. And Rose said no. He was, he liked being a gadfly and being able to pick his specific issues. And he also said he didn't think he could win, which I thought was interesting, because if Bernie Sanders used that as a reason, for running in 2016, he never would have ran, because he never thought he could win. He just thought that he would, pull.
But a leadership fight is slightly different. I will just say, like, I think Roe was being super honest with you right there. When you come for the crown, you best not miss. And in a leadership fight, that's intra-party. It's not running for president. It's like all fairs out there, but intra-party that's the game that politicians are actually playing all the time. Committee assignments, right? Like the whole thing. And Pelosi is formidable. And there's a reason that she doesn't get challenged often. And there's a reason why people are waiting to see if she's actually going to say or do what she said she was going to do, which is step down. Because then all's up for grabs, right? And that's when you build for the moment when you can take your shot, you might have a chance at it. Otherwise, you're just, you're just throwing away your power. You're just diminishing your power. And so anyways, I feel like these fights are, we lost a lot of fights, right? Like, we're winning a lot, and that's true, but like we got just crushed on some committee fights that we had. And the new Dems, when I said Josh Gottheimer before and Stephanie Murphy, these are the names that are of Democrats who are ideologically opposed to progressivism, right? Like they're against the things that we are for ideologically. And their caucus, the New Dems, they shut us out of a few fights, right? Like they're powerful. So to not even know that, right? Like that's my problem with some people's strategy, is like they're not even looking at the opponents that we have, and they're definitely not recognizing that those opponents have a lot of power. And so you have to build up a lot of power. We're 2 cycles into this sort of the squad plus, this progressive, like the weight that we have. Progressives have been there for a long time, but the new progressive aggressiveness, and Pramila just redid the entire caucus to be much more bold and focused and ideologically driven, and a counterweight to the New Dems.
And I asked her, so funny, because on my show, she was on my show last spring, and I asked her if she was going to do something like that. I said, how do you have people who are members of the New Dems and the Progressive Caucus? It's just kind of antithetical. And she said, well, it's not a member of what other caucuses they are, it's how they're going to vote. And because I said, shouldn't you tighten the rules for who can get into your caucus? And she sort of, pushed back against that. But then I noticed that she did exactly what I had suggested that she do. So I felt good about that.
It took them a while. It took them a while to get the pieces in place to do the switch. And the reality was that the CPC was being treated by some members, a lot of members are really great and driven, but some of them saw it as primary insurance, right? So like the New Dems, who are also members of the CPC, they were members of the CPC so that they could be like, what, I'm a progressive. You can't primary me from the left. I'm a member of the CPC. And that has been changed now. Now, here's the truth, though. We still haven't seen a toe-to-toe match, right? So like, we don't know. We haven't seen a showdown between the new CPC and the progressive voting bloc and the New Dems on something real, and we will. There'll be appropriations battles. There'll be, the farm bill will be a big one. Farm bill is going to be a huge one because there'll be a showdown between big ag and not big ag, but people who want to use agricultural policy for the benefit of the people and not for these 5 corporations. So like, we need to have these showdowns, and we need to like win. Our folks are championing our issues. We line up behind them and flex against the actual opponents. And we probably will lose some. We might win them all, but like, that's the fight. So if your strategy is to just like aim at the people who could be your paladins, like, who else is going to carry your policies, right? Doesn't make any sense even. I feel we've given them more air than they deserve, because I found that I muted like 17 people on Twitter and they disappear from me. They definitely are not an entity in Washington, D.C.
Well, I just want to continue with just another minute more, because they are people who watch my show, and I think that they do respect me. And so I just want to reason this out just a little bit more. Because I think that what it breeds, and I said this when I was arguing with people on Twitter, and some people who didn't just reflexively block me, which I find is so stupid. I mean, what you said, muting is one thing, but for somebody to protect their tweets against me when I'm not even going on to their, into their mentions and insulting them, they're actually, I respond to Ryan, and this one says, "Fuck off, Lauren, you're trolling." And I'm like, oh, so let me get this straight, because I don't understand the rules of Twitter. He makes a post, and unless I agree with what he says, that means I'm a troll. But anyway, regardless, by the time I finished telling this other woman all that I had done as an activist and an organizer for Medicare for All, she had a lot of respect for me. So what I did in 2017 is what we need to continue to do. And that is go to once they start having them again, go to these town halls of these Democrats. And I organized a group of us to go to Maxine Waters, Linda Sanchez, Adam Schiff, Brad Sherman, and Tony Cardenas. And by God, we got them all to sign on, because we were going there and we were disrupting their town halls, and we were just grilling them. And they would say their excuses. And there's similar excuses this time. They would say, oh, we're trying to save the ACA, and we're like, you could do both. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. And we just kept coming at them with our logic and our reasoning, and enough numbers in that audience that it became really clear. And I'll remember one guy, Brad Sherman, whose policy director was actually holding the mic for me. And he said, well, I'd love to meet with you, and because I have some questions, and, we'd love to hear your answers to these questions and some of our objections. So I took Maureen Cruz, who was the head of Healthcare for All Los Angeles, to lunch with him. And we sat down with him for an hour, and we went over these questions and objections. And within weeks, he signed on. And that's what we need to do. The activists can still disrupt, but they need to go after this low-hanging fruit. Like you were saying, Frank Pallone.
Signed on to Medicare for All. So like, this is where I'd like to sort of end the discussion, is that there's real activism happening, and it's bearing fruit, and it might not be as shiny as some other stuff, but going year after year after year, our allies were going into Frank Pallone's office in DC, in the district, going to all the events and just raising Medicare for All every time and showing him that this is an issue that his constituents care about. Frank Pallone is the chair of Energy and Commerce. Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce are the two most important committees in the House. Energy and Commerce has primary jurisdiction on Medicare for All. It's the shot caller committee on it. He's the chair of it. He got on Medicare for All. He agreed to a hearing this Congress. I mean, like, the enormity of that is you can't even overstate how big a deal that is. And that happened solely because of people power, because of slow, methodical. It wasn't that slow. We've been organizing a few cycles on it, and we've been slowly but surely building more support for Medicare for All in a strategic way. And what I would say is, if you want to fight to win Medicare for All, if that's your goal, is getting health care for every single person in this country and abolishing a system that lets people die for profit, defeating big pharma, defeating big hospital, defeating big insurance. If that's what you want to do, send me an email. I'll invite you to the spreadsheets. Like, we want people in our movement. If what you want is some sort of like weird internet clout that you get from like calling out, people and being like leftier than thou, but with no power, I'm not playing that game.
Right.
Because like ideological purity without power leads to nothing.
Yeah.
No one's life is going to get better.
And worse, it's so cynical, it's nihilistic. It demotivates people, and it leads to inaction. And we want people to be activists. So on that note, I want to tell people that they should fight for Medicare for All, even though Bernie isn't really bringing it up, even though he wrote the damn bill, and even though AOC is using the word health care instead of Medicare for All. These little things that people are glomming onto, Bernie's playing the long game. He's been supporting Medicare for All since the 80s, and he's not going to give up. He's just working on the leverage points that he has now. So, like we used to say in Occupy, practice a diversity of tactics. You can work on your legislator. If your legislator has already sponsored it, then go help in another district, Or in California, we have a new state bill, CalCare. People probably don't remember that in Canada, it got started in Saskatchewan, and it became a province by province by province thing. So I know certain people don't like the idea of it starting in the States, but diversity of tactics, we should try everything. And Alex, I want to thank you so much for staying on so long. It's really been great. I hope you'll come on again to
Absolutely.
talk about all the other things that we have to talk about.
Absolutely. Let's do everything that we can to shorten the path to Medicare for All. That's what we have to do. We can't get led down any garden paths away from our goal. We only lose if we forget what we're fighting for. But we should take whatever gains we can on that shorten the path to Medicare for All. And California might be only one of 50 states, but it's California. If we get California to have a single payer system, we're a lot closer to a national system. I would love to come back on and talk about all the things. Great time here. Thank you.
And how can people follow you?
You can go to socialsecurityworks.org. If you sign up for our emails, we will send you you'll be right in the middle of all of our fights. I'm on Twitter at ALaw202, or Social Security Works is at SSWorks. And I don't know if you want to check out my radio station. It's We Act Radio on Twitter, at We Act Radio.
And you do a great show. It's called Solidarity Now.
Solidarity Live, but we want solidarity now.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Alex. I'm going to let you go while I promote next week's show.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. All right, folks, that was Alex Lawson, and we had a great talk. Thank you all who stuck with us the entire time. Next week, I think I'm going to have on Julie Mayfield, who is a state senator who represents part of the Asheville area, and she's a Democrat. She's going to talk about what's going on in the state house in North Carolina, where the Democrats are in a minority, and they have a budget coming out. The governor is a Democrat, but they've managed to take away all his power, just as they've taken away all the power of the local municipalities. This is the first time you've seen my show. You can follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, Lauren_Steiner. So thank you very much. Stay safe and keep fighting.